I signed off on that building because I believed doing my job right was worth more than being liked. On a Tuesday morning in Arizona, I was watering my lawn at 6:30 a.m. Same routine I'd had for years, when an email hit my phone. No subject line, just a scanned blueprint I recognized instantly. I noticed the timestamp first. It was dated 3 days after the man died. And suddenly, everything I'd called professional judgment started to feel very fragile. I wake up every morning at 5:42 a.m., not because I need to, but because my body still does it for me. 30 years of inspections, early site visits, and sunrise deadlines trained something into my bones that retirement never erased. By the time the alarm goes off, I'm already awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it turns slow. One soft click every rotation. Same sound, same pace. Predictable. I like that. My name is Michael Donovan. I'm 52 years old, and until 3 years ago, I was a senior safety inspector for the city of Phoenix. Construction sites, commercial buildings, permits, compliance reports. I was the guy people complained about when projects stalled and the guy they blamed when something went wrong. I took a certain pride in that. If everyone was mad at me, it usually meant I was doing my job. These days, my mornings are quieter. No steel-toed boots by the door, no radio chatter, just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of my sprinklers kicking on at exactly 6 a.m. The grass in my front yard is real, not turf, which makes me something of an oddity in Scottsdale. I keep it trimmed, low and green. It gives me something to maintain that doesn't argue back. I pour my coffee into the same chipped white mug I've owned since my daughter was in high school. The handle's cracked, but it hasn't failed yet. Neither have I, as far as I know. I stand at the kitchen counter and drink half of it before I even sit down. Outside, the street is empty, except for a delivery truck rolling past too fast for this neighborhood. Most mornings, it feels like the world hasn't fully turned on yet. People assume retirement is an ending. For me, it was more like a long exhale. No more hearings. No more developers leaning in too close and lowering their voices. No more being the last signature before concrete got poured. I did my time. I followed the rules. When I left, my record was clean. No investigations, no lawsuits with my name on them. That matters to me. My daughter used to tease me about that. She said I trusted paperwork more than people. She wasn't wrong. Paper doesn't cry. Paper doesn't make excuses. Paper doesn't ask you to look the other way. Her name was Claire. She died 8 years ago, and there are still days when that sentence feels unfinished. A car accident on the I-17, late at night, hit by a driver who never even stopped. I was out of town on a conference trip when it happened. I learned about it from a voicemail I listened to twice because the words didn't make sense the first time. After the funeral, after the casseroles and the cards, I went back to work. That's how I survived it. Routine, structure, forward motion. Claire's husband, Daniel, stayed in my life. At first, out of necessity, then out of habit. He remarried 2 years after her death, a woman named Laura, polite, organized. She keeps a color-coded calendar on her phone and calls me Mike, which I don't love, but I don't correct her. They bring my grandson, Noah, over every other Sunday. He's 10 now. Thin legs, serious eyes. Likes to ask how things work. That's probably my fault. On Sundays, I grill burgers. Always well done. Claire used to roll her eyes at that too. Noah eats with ketchup only. No bun. Daniel talks about work. Laura scrolls through her phone and nods at the right moments. It's a system. It functions. I don't ask for more than that. People think grief fades. What it actually does is settle. It finds a place and stays there, like dust on a high shelf. You stop noticing it, unless you're looking for something else, and brush against it by accident. I don't go looking. After breakfast, I usually spend an hour in my garage. It's clean in a way garages usually aren't. Tools lined up, labels facing forward. The workbench still has faint burn marks from projects I don't remember starting. I keep old inspection binders stacked on a shelf, even though there's no reason to. My wife used to say I was afraid to throw away proof that I existed. She left before Claire died. Different story, different kind of quiet. That Tuesday morning started like all the others. Coffee, sprinklers, garage. The only difference was the heat came earlier than usual. By 7 a.m., the air already felt thick. I remember thinking summer was arriving ahead of schedule. Climate's been doing that lately. I was in the middle of reorganizing a box of old flash drives when my phone buzzed on the workbench. One vibration, no ringtone. I don't keep notifications on. If someone needs me, they can call. This wasn't a call. I wiped my hands on a rag and picked up the phone, expecting spam. The screen showed an email notification. No sender name, just a string of letters and numbers where the address should have been. No subject line. That caught my attention. Most junk mail tries too hard. Free offers. Urgent warnings. This one didn't try at all. I tapped it open. There was no message. Just a single attachment. To a PDF. For a second, I considered deleting it without opening it. That's what I would have told anyone else to do. Unknown sender. No context. Basic digital hygiene. But something about the silence of it made me pause. The garage felt warmer all of a sudden, or maybe I was just aware of my own breathing. I opened the file. It took less than a second to load, and I knew exactly what I was looking at before I read a single word. A structural blueprint. Commercial grade. Older formatting. The kind the city stopped using about a decade ago. My eyes went straight to the bottom right corner, where the revision history lives. Project name, site address, permit number. I recognized all of it. My thumb hovered over the screen. I hadn't thought about that project in years. No reason to. It was closed, archived, finished. I scrolled down slowly, not because I needed to, but because I didn't want to rush the moment where something might change. The lines were familiar. Load calculations, support beams, everything exactly where it was supposed to be. Then I noticed the timestamp, not the date the plans were created. The date they were last modified. It was 3 days after the incident. I stood there staring at it, the phone heavy in my hand, the sprinkler system outside clicking off one zone at a time like it always did. The garage door was open, letting in the smell of wet grass and hot concrete. Somewhere down the street, a car alarm chirped once and stopped. 3 days after. That didn't make sense. I told myself there had to be an explanation. There's always an explanation. Clerical error, digital migration, someone reopening an old file for reference. I'd seen stranger things in city systems. I set the phone face down on the bench and went back to the box of flash drives, suddenly very aware of how quiet the house was. I didn't feel afraid. Not yet. What I felt was something closer to irritation, like finding a crack in a wall you were sure was solid, small, inconvenient, easy to ignore if you didn't stare at it too long. But as I stood there, listening to nothing but my own breath and the faint hum of electricity, a thought settled in that I couldn't shake. Everything I believed about that job, about how it ended, about the way I'd walked away clean and certain, it all depended on the idea that nothing had changed after I signed my name. And now, for the first time, I wasn't sure that was true. I left the phone face down on the workbench longer than I needed to. Long enough for the screen to go dark on its own. Long enough for my coffee to go cold in the kitchen. I told myself I'd look at it again after I finished what I was doing. That's how I've always handled things I don't like. Delay them until they either disappear or become unavoidable. I finished organizing the flash drives. Lined them up by year, even though I couldn't tell you the last time I used one. Then I wiped down the bench, hung the rag back on its hook, and closed the garage door. The sound echoed more than usual. A hollow thud that lingered a second too long. Inside, the house felt smaller. Not claustrophobic, just tighter. The kind of quiet that presses in instead of stretching out. I poured the rest of the coffee down the sink and rinsed the mug without really looking at it. My hands were steady. That felt important. I picked up the phone again and reopened the email. Still no message, just the file. I zoomed in on the blueprint, pinched the screen, traced the lines with my thumb like I used to with a pen. Everything looked right, too right. I checked the metadata. That was habit more than curiosity. Years of catching sloppy paperwork trained me to look where most people didn't. The modification date matched what I'd seen before. 3 days after the incident. The author field was blank. That bothered me more than it should have. City files almost always have a name attached. Even when someone tries to clean their tracks, something usually slips through. Initials, a department code. This was sterile, like it had been passed through too many hands, or maybe none at all. I locked the phone and set it on the counter. My reflection stared back at me from the microwave door. Same man, same lines around the eyes, nothing visibly cracked. I told myself that if there was a problem, it would show itself clearly. Problems always do. That's what inspectors are trained to believe. Around 9, Daniel texted me. A photo of Noah holding a science fair project. Some kind of bridge made out of popsicle sticks and glue. The caption read, "He wants to know if this would pass inspection." I smiled despite myself and typed back, "Depends who signed off on it." He sent a laughing emoji. I didn't. I spent the next hour doing chores I didn't need to do, folding towels that were already folded, sorting mail I'd already sorted, anything to keep my hands moving while my mind circled the same question. Why now? If someone wanted money, there were easier ways. If they wanted attention, they would have said something. The silence felt intentional, like a knock on a door followed by footsteps walking away. At 17, the doorbell rang. I froze in the hallway, my brain taking a second longer than usual to catch up. I wasn't expecting anyone. My first thought was a delivery, even though I hadn't ordered anything. My second thought was that this was connected, which felt ridiculous and immediate all at once. I opened the door. A woman stood on the porch holding a clipboard. Early 30s, brown hair pulled back tight. No uniform, but professional enough that she looked like she belonged there. She gave me a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Donovan?" she asked. "Yes. I'm with Southwest Home Services. We're doing routine checks in the area. It won't take more than a few minutes." I glanced past her at the street. No truck. No logo. Just her car parked half a block down, angled slightly toward the curb like she hadn't planned to stay long. "I didn't schedule anything," I said. She nodded, already writing something down. "You're not required to. It's complimentary. We just need to confirm a few details." That should have been the end of it, a simple no. But something about the way she said, "confirm," made my stomach tighten. I stepped aside and let her in. She didn't look around much. No curiosity about the house. No comments on the photos or the furniture. She went straight to the thermostat, checked the serial number, then asked about the age of the roof. Normal questions. Predictable ones. Then she asked, "Have you had any recent structural work done? Foundation repairs? Load-bearing modifications?" I looked at her. "No, that's Sev." She made a small note. "Any issues with the garage support beam?" My pulse ticked up. "No." She smiled again. "Good. Sometimes records don't update the way they should." That was the odd thing. The small, quiet detail that didn't belong. She said it casually, like it was a comment about the weather. Then she thanked me for my time and left without offering a brochure or a card. I watched her walk down the driveway and get into her car. She didn't turn around, didn't check her phone, just drove off. I stood there longer than I needed to, the front door still open, letting the heat in. When I closed it, the latch clicked louder than usual. I went back to the kitchen and picked up my phone. No new emails, no missed calls. I opened the blueprint again and stared at the same corner I had before, the revision box. My name wasn't on it. That should have reassured me. It didn't. I tried to remember the last time I'd been on that site. The smell of dust and oil, the way the foreman avoided eye contact, the clipboard heavy in my hand. I remembered being tired, remembered wanting the day to be over. I did not remember anything changing after I signed. At noon, I drove to the storage unit on McDowell. I hadn't been there in months. Most of what I kept there was old work gear, binders I couldn't bring myself to throw away. I unlocked the unit and flipped on the light. The bulb flickered once before settling. The binder I wanted was exactly where it should have been. Red spine, faded label. I pulled it out and sat on the concrete floor, legs crossed like I used to do at sites when there was nowhere clean to stand. The report was intact. My handwriting was steady. Dates matched, photos stapled where they belonged. everything neat and final. If I'd been reviewing someone else's work, I would have approved it without question. I closed the binder and leaned back against the wall. The air smelled like cardboard and metal. I felt stupid for being there, for letting an email and a clipboard knock me off balance. On the drive home, my phone buzzed again. Unknown number this time. I let it go to voicemail. The message was short. Mr. Donovan, this is Ethan. You don't know me, but I know your name. Check the third page of the file again. Call me when you're ready. No threat. No explanation. Just that. I pulled over and replayed it once, then again. Ethan. The name didn't register. Not immediately. I drove the rest of the way home slower than usual, every stoplight feeling like a decision. Back in the kitchen, I opened the PDF and went to the third page. I'd skimmed it before without really seeing it. This time, I zoomed in. There was a handwritten note in the margin. Small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. Blue ink, familiar slant. Temporary adjustment. Will correct later. My handwriting. I sat down hard in the chair, the wood creaking under my weight. My mouth went dry. I knew that note. I'd written it 100 times on 100 files when a fix was scheduled but not urgent. A placeholder, a promise to myself. I had no memory of correcting it. The clock on the microwave read 2:03 p.m. The house was silent, except for the ticking I'd never noticed before. I stared at the note until the letters blurred. This wasn't about someone framing me. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about memory, about what I'd decided mattered in a moment I could no longer see clearly. I picked up the phone and dialed the number from the voicemail. It rang twice. Mr. Donovan, the voice said calmly. I was wondering when you'd call. I closed my eyes. For the first time since retirement, since Claire, since everything I thought I'd put behind me, I felt the ground shift. Not violently, just enough to know that whatever came next wasn't going to let me stand where I was anymore. Ethan didn't say anything else on the line. No greeting beyond my name. No explanation. Just his voice, steady and unhurried, like he'd been expecting this moment and didn't feel the need to rush it. I'm listening, I said. I know, he replied. That's why I called. There was a pause. Not an awkward one. A deliberate one. I could hear faint background noise on his end, traffic maybe, or wind, somewhere outdoors. He wasn't sitting behind a desk rehearsing a speech. That mattered more than I wanted it to. You wrote that note during the second inspection, he continued. Not the final one. My throat tightened. How do you know that? Because I was there, he said, holding the ladder while you climbed up. The image came back without warning. Sun bouncing off metal, the smell of hot steel, a ladder that didn't quite sit flat on the concrete. I remembered adjusting it with my foot, annoyed that nothing ever lined up the way it was supposed to. What do you want? I asked. Nothing, Ethan said. Not from you. Not anymore. That word anymore landed heavier than the rest. I stared at the wall above the sink, a small chip in the paint I'd been meaning to fix for months. Then why send the file? I said. Another pause, shorter this time. Because you deserve to remember, he said, and because no one else will ever ask you to. The line went dead. I didn't move for a long time. The phone stayed pressed to my ear even after the call ended, like my body hadn't caught up to the fact that it was over. When I finally lowered it, my hand was damp with sweat. I replayed the conversation in my head, searching for accusation, for threat. There wasn't any. That was the problem. If he'd been angry, I could have defended myself. If he'd demanded something, I could have refused. But he'd done neither. He'd simply handed something back to me and stepped away. I went into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on my knees. The afternoon light slanted in through the blinds, striping the carpet in pale gold. Dust floated in the air, visible only because I was sitting still long enough to notice it. I tried to reconstruct that day the way I would have reconstructed an incident report. Step by step, arrival time, weather conditions, personnel present. My mind resisted at first, sliding away from the details like they were coated in oil. Then, slowly, things began to stick. It was hot, hotter than forecasted. The crew was behind schedule. The foreman kept checking his watch, then looking at me like I was the one holding it back. I'd already flagged 3 issues that morning, minor ones, fixable ones. Each correction pushed their timeline further out. I remembered the beam. It wasn't a catastrophic flaw, not something that screamed danger at a glance. The load calculation was close enough that, on paper, it passed. Close enough that a temporary adjustment didn't feel like a lie. Just a delay. Just a note in the margin. I remembered thinking I'd come back after lunch. I didn't. Something else came up. It always did. Another site. Another call. Another problem that felt more urgent. By the time I signed the final report, the note had faded into the background, buried under pages of compliance and checkboxes. I'd convinced myself it had been handled, or maybe I'd simply stopped asking. That night, I barely slept. Not because of panic. Panic is loud. This was quieter than that. A low hum under everything, like standing too close to a transformer without realizing it. I lay awake listening to the ceiling fan click through its rotations, counting them without meaning to. At 3:12 a.m., I got up and went to the garage. I pulled the binder out again, flipping through it slower this time. I found the page with the note and held it under the workbench light. The ink had faded slightly, but the slant was unmistakable. I'd written it quickly, carelessly, confident that I'd remember what it meant later. Confidence is a dangerous thing. At sunrise, I showered and dressed like I had somewhere to be. Button-down shirt, clean jeans, shoes I only wore when I needed to feel put together. I didn't know where I was going yet, but sitting still wasn't an option. I drove back toward the old industrial district, following roads my hands remembered even when my mind hesitated. The site itself had been redeveloped years ago, a logistics warehouse now, sleek and sealed. No trace of the scaffolding and dust that once filled the lot. I parked across the street and sat in the car, watching trucks roll in and out with practiced efficiency. No one looked up. No one remembered what had happened there. That's how these things disappear, not with denial, but with replacement. I took out my phone and opened the photo Ethan had included in the package. The angle was wrong, low and off to the side. Taken by someone who hadn't been standing where they were supposed to stand. Someone on the ground, looking up. Someone holding a ladder. My chest tightened, and I had to look away. I didn't call Ethan back. Not that day. I wasn't ready to hear anything else. I needed to sit with what I already knew and see if it could stand on its own. That afternoon, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. Noah with him. They'd been in the area, he said. Thought they'd say hi. I nodded and let them in, forcing myself to smile. Noah went straight to the garage, like he always did. Daniel leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. "You okay?" he asked without looking up. "Yeah," I said. "Just tired." He nodded. "Campaign stuff's been crazy," he said. "Laura's been on me about yard signs and mailers. You'd think I was running for something important." I looked at him, really looked at him. The easy confidence, the way his voice lifted when he talked about being visible, about being trusted. He caught my expression and frowned slightly. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Just thinking." He shrugged and went back to his phone. Noah emerged from the garage holding a level, proudly explaining how he'd figured out whether the shelf was straight. I listened, nodded in the right places, answered his questions. I was good at that, always had been. After they left, the house felt emptier than before. Not quieter, emptier, like something had been removed without replacing it. That evening, I finally sat down at the kitchen table and opened my laptop. I searched the incident report online, public record, archived. The language was clean, impersonal. One fatality, cause, structural failure due to unforeseen load stress. Unforeseen. I closed the browser and stared at the blank screen. My reflection hovered there faintly, superimposed over the words I didn't want to read anymore. I thought about the man who died, about the family he might have had, about the name I'd never bothered to memorize because it hadn't been required. Ethan had said he didn't want anything. I believed him, but I also knew something now that I hadn't known before. The truth didn't need permission to exist. It just needed someone willing to stop pretending it belonged to the past. I shut the laptop and sat there until the light outside faded completely, the kitchen lit only by the small bulb over the sink. The same one Claire used to complain about. For years, I'd believed my job was to keep things standing, to prevent collapse, to make sure the structures held. What I was beginning to understand slowly, painfully, was that sometimes the most dangerous failures aren't the ones that bring buildings down. They're the ones that let you walk away thinking everything is fine. The package arrived 2 days later. It wasn't delivered by the postal service. No logo, no tracking email. Just a brown cardboard box sitting on my front step when I opened the door that morning. Medium size, light enough to lift with one hand. No return address, no name, only my street number written in thick black marker, slightly slanted, like whoever wrote it had been standing instead of leaning on a surface. I stood there longer than I should have, the desert heat already creeping up through the concrete, the sun barely over the rooftops. A jogger passed at the end of the street, earbuds in, ponytail bouncing. Ordinary life continuing without pause. I carried the box inside and set it on the kitchen table. The cardboard was warm, not from the sun but from being handled recently. That detail lodged itself in my mind without asking permission. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first, toasted a piece of bread I didn't eat, turned the radio on low, then off again when the voices felt intrusive. When I finally pulled a knife from the drawer, my hand hesitated just long enough for me to notice. The tape peeled back easily. Whoever sealed it hadn't bothered reinforcing the seams. Inside were 3 things: a spiral-bound notebook, a folded high-visibility safety vest, the kind worn on construction sites, and a flash drive taped to the inside of the box lid, like an afterthought. I recognized the vest immediately. Same brand we'd issued to inspectors for years, faded orange, reflective stripes dulled from sun and dust. I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. There was a tear along the left seam, repaired with black thread in uneven stitches. I remembered that tear. The notebook was heavier than it looked. Black cover, no label. When I opened it, the pages were filled edge to edge with handwriting. Not mine. Neat, methodical. Dates along the margins, times, weather conditions, names. Some I recognized. Some I didn't. It took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. It was a log, not an official one. No city header, no case numbers, just observations, corrections noted, issues flagged, conversations recorded in clipped phrases. The kind of notes a junior engineer might keep when he didn't trust anyone else to remember what mattered. I flipped through the pages slowly, my fingers leaving faint smudges on the paper. Every few entries, there was a small asterisk in the margin, a system I didn't understand yet. Halfway through the notebook, I found a page that made me sit down. My name was written at the top. Below it, in the same careful handwriting, were 3 bullet points. Inspector arrived late. Second inspection incomplete. Temporary adjustment acknowledged. I closed the notebook and pressed my palm flat against the cover. The kitchen felt too bright, too exposed. I carried the box into the living room and pulled the curtains partway closed, like that would keep something from seeing me. The flash drive was old, scratched casing, a cheap promotional model, the kind handed out at conferences. I plugged it into my laptop and waited. There were folders inside, labeled by date. I opened the earliest one. Photos, dozens of them, taken from different angles, different distances, the same beam, the same support structure, over time. Before reinforcement, after the temporary adjustment, after the pour, after the site reopened. I clicked through them in silence, my jaw tightening with each image. These weren't casual shots. They were deliberate, taken by someone who knew exactly what they were documenting and why. Then I opened the video file. The footage was shaky at first. Wind noise, voices in the background. I recognized my own voice before I saw myself. Slightly distorted through the cheap microphone, but unmistakable. "We'll circle back," I heard myself say. "Just need it stable for now." The camera tilted up, catching my boots on the ladder rungs, the safety vest, the tear in the seam. Ethan's hands entered the frame briefly, adjusting the ladder, steadying it. He didn't speak, just held it in place while I climbed. The video ended abruptly, cutting to black. I sat there for a long time, the laptop still open, the last frame burned into my vision. There was no commentary, No dramatic music, no attempt to frame me as a villain, just evidence. I didn't feel anger or fear. What I felt was a slow, creeping sense of exposure, like realizing a room you thought was private had windows you never noticed. I called Ethan that afternoon. He answered on the first ring. "You got it," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Why didn't you send this before?" "I wanted to be sure you'd look," he said. "People delete things when they feel accused. I wasn't accusing you." I swallowed. "What were you doing all this time?" There was a pause, longer than before. "Living," he said, "and keeping records." "For what purpose?" "So I wouldn't forget," he replied. "And so neither would you." I closed my eyes. "You could have gone to the city, the press, a lawyer." "Yes," he said. "I could have." 8. "Why didn't you?" "Because that would have made it about punishment," Ethan said calmly. "This isn't." I leaned back in the chair, the wood creaking beneath me. "Then what is it about?" "It's about the difference between what the law allows and what you can live with," he said. After we hung up, I took the notebook into the garage and sat on the floor with it, reading every page. Ethan's notes extended beyond the site. Beyond the incident, they tracked his attempts to report concerns. Emails sent, meetings requested, responses delayed or ignored. There was no bitterness in the writing, no sarcasm, just persistence. On the last page, there was a short entry dated 3 months ago. Stopped waiting for the system to notice. Time to speak directly. That night, I dreamed of ladders. I was climbing one that never reached the top, each rung bending slightly under my weight. Below me, someone held it steady, their face just out of view. I woke before I fell, heart pounding. The image of my boots hovering over empty space burned into my mind. The next morning, Daniel called. "I need to ask you something," he said, his tone careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Okay. You remember that warehouse collapse years back?" he asked. "The one that was all over the local news?" "Yes. Someone's been asking questions about it," he said. "Old questions. City Hall stuff." I closed my eyes. "Who?" He hesitated. "I don't know, but Laura thinks it might come up. And with the campaign, well, I wanted to give you a heads up. A heads up? A courtesy. The kind that assumes silence." "I appreciate that," I said. There was a pause. "Everything's solid, right?" Daniel asked. "I mean, you did your job. It was all investigated." "Yes," I said automatically. The word came out too quickly. After the call ended, I stood in the kitchen staring at the safety vest draped over the back of a chair. The tear along the seam caught the light, the black thread stark against the faded orange. I thought about how many times I'd worn that vest, believing it made me visible, protected, accountable. What I was starting to understand was that visibility isn't the same as honesty. That afternoon, I drove to a hardware store and bought a small, fireproof lockbox. The cashier didn't look at me when she rang it up. I placed the notebook, the flash drive, and the vest inside and locked it. Not to hide them, to keep them, because something had shifted. The ground beneath me wasn't collapsing. Not yet. But it was no longer solid in the way I'd built my life around. And for the first time since I'd signed my last report and walked away clean, I realized this wasn't about defending my past. It was about deciding what kind of man I was willing to be now that the evidence had finally caught up with my memory. I didn't open the lockbox again for 3 days. Not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I already knew. There's a point where evidence stops adding information and starts demanding action. I wasn't ready for that yet. I needed time to understand what, exactly, I was being asked to carry. Those 3 days passed slowly, not in the dramatic sense. No sirens, no confrontations, just ordinary life continuing as if nothing had changed. And that, more than anything else, made it harder. On Thursday morning, I drove Noah to school. Daniel had an early meeting. Laura was out of town, and I'd offered without thinking. Noah climbed into the passenger seat with his backpack slung low, earbuds dangling unused around his neck. He asked if we could stop for breakfast sandwiches on the way. I said yes. We waited in line at a drive-thru while the sun climbed over the strip mall roofs. As I handed him the bag, he asked, "Grandpa, what happens if a bridge looks fine but isn't?" I glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "In science class," he said, unwrapping the sandwich carefully. "We watched a video where a bridge stayed up for years and then just fell. They said it was because of a mistake nobody noticed at the start." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel. "Sometimes," I said, choosing each word deliberately, "things fail slowly before they fail all at once." "Sistin." He nodded, satisfied, and went back to his sandwich. I pulled away from the curb and merged into traffic, my chest tight in a way I couldn't explain to a 10-year-old. After I dropped him off, I didn't go home. I drove instead, no destination in mind, letting my hands guide the wheel while my thoughts kept circling the same point. Ethan hadn't accused me. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't even asked for acknowledgement. But in a way, that made what he'd done heavier. He'd given me my own decisions back, unfiltered. By Friday afternoon, I opened the lockbox again. I laid everything out on the dining table. Notebook, vest, flash drive. I turned off my phone and flipped it face down. This wasn't something I wanted interrupted. I started with the notebook, reading it front to back without skipping. Ethan's handwriting stayed consistent, even when the entries stretched over months. No dramatic language, no editorializing, just facts, observed and recorded. The asterisks in the margins turned out to mark moments where concerns had been verbally acknowledged but not formally logged. Moments like the one I'd forgotten. I moved on to the city reports next, pulling up digital copies on my laptop and comparing them side by side with Ethan's notes. That's when the pattern emerged. Not a conspiracy, not corruption in the usual sense. Efficiency. Problems that slowed timelines were reframed as manageable. Temporary adjustments became assumed corrections. Follow-ups were scheduled, then quietly absorbed into future agendas that never circled back. And I had participated in that system. Not maliciously, not greedily, but willingly. There's a particular kind of shame that comes from realizing you weren't careless, you were convenient. The video was last. I watched it again, this time without looking away. I listened to my own voice, calm and assured, saying words that felt reasonable in the moment and damning in retrospect. I saw the confidence in my movements, the ease with which I treated the adjustment as temporary, as someone else's problem later. When the screen went black, I didn't close the laptop. I sat there and let the silence do its work. The truth settled in slowly, not as a shock but as a weight. This wasn't about someone altering records after the fact. The timestamp wasn't evidence of tampering. It was evidence of continuity, of a system that adjusted itself around my decision without ever forcing me to revisit it. I'd been looking for an external villain because it was easier than accepting the obvious one. I was the failure point. That realization didn't come with panic. It came with clarity. Sharp and uncomfortable, like cold water on skin that's been numb too long. The man had died because the structure failed. The structure had failed because of load stress. The load stress had been foreseeable, and I had chosen to move on anyway. No one had forced my hand. No one had bribed me. No one had lied to me. I had made a professional judgment call that favored momentum over caution, and then I'd trusted the system to absorb the risk. It did, until it didn't. That evening, I searched for the victim's name. It took longer than it should have, partly because I hadn't remembered it, and partly because the reports had buried it under neutral language. When I finally found it, I said it out loud. Once, then again. Hearing it didn't change the facts, but it changed the shape of them. I found an old article with a photo attached. A man in a hard hat, smiling slightly, arm around a woman I assumed was his wife. 2 kids standing in front of them, one holding a toy truck. I closed the browser and stared at the table. Ethan hadn't included that photo. He hadn't sent names or faces. He hadn't tried to make this emotional. That had been my job all along, and I'd neglected it. Saturday morning, Daniel came by alone. He didn't sit down, just stood near the doorway, hands in his pockets, shifting his weight. "I heard back from City Hall," he said. "There's some chatter, nothing official." I waited. "They're saying someone might reopen old safety cases. Not this one specifically, just in general." He hesitated. If anything comes up, I'll handle it. I don't want this affecting Noah. There it was. The unspoken expectation, silence as protection, history as something to be managed. I nodded slowly. That makes sense. Relief flickered across his face. Good, he said. I knew you'd understand. After he left, I sat at the dining table for a long time, staring at the lockbox key resting near my coffee mug. I thought about Claire, about the way she used to challenge my certainty without mocking it, about how she'd hated the phrase acceptable risk. That afternoon, I called Ethan again. He answered, same calm as before. I think I understand now, I said. I hoped you would, he replied. I didn't realize I was waiting for the system to correct me, I said. I thought that was accountability. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Most people do. What do you want me to do? I asked. I don't want you to do anything, he said. I wanted you to know. What you choose after that is yours. I leaned back in the chair, the wood pressing into my spine. If I do nothing, I said carefully, the world keeps moving. No one gets hurt now. Yes, he agreed. And if I speak, I continued, there are consequences. For people who didn't cause this. Yes, he said again. The honesty of it left no room to hide. After we hung up, I took the safety vest from the table and held it up. The tear in the seam felt larger now, more obvious. I wondered how many times I'd walked past it without noticing because I'd stopped expecting my tools to fail. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because of a question that wouldn't leave me alone. If accountability only matters when someone forces it, is it still accountability? By Sunday morning, I knew the answer I was going to live with. I locked the materials back in the box, not to forget them, but to acknowledge that what I was facing wasn't a mistake to be corrected. It was a choice I'd already made once, years ago, and was now being asked to make again, this time with my eyes open. I stood in the kitchen, the house quiet, sunlight stretching across the floor, and understood something I hadn't before. The most dangerous thing I'd ever signed off on wasn't a building. It was my own belief that doing nothing could still count as doing right. I met Ethan for the first time the following Wednesday. We chose a place neither of us had any history with, a diner just off Route 60 that smelled like burnt coffee and fryer oil. The kind of place where the booths were cracked and no one asked how long you planned to stay. He'd suggested it in a text, neutral ground. I arrived early and took a booth near the window. The vinyl seat stuck to the back of my legs as I slid in. I ordered coffee I didn't want and watched the parking lot through the glass, counting cars out of habit. Ethan pulled in exactly at 9:14 a.m. He didn't look the way I'd imagined. Younger than I expected. Mid-30s, maybe. Lean, not in a gym way, but in the way people get when they've spent years carrying weight that isn't visible. He wore jeans, work boots, and a gray long-sleeve shirt with the sleeves pushed up. No safety vest, no badge, just a man walking in alone. He spotted me immediately. "Mr. Donovan," he said, stopping at the edge of the booth. "Michael?" I corrected. He nodded once and slid in across from me. Up close, I noticed his hands first, scarred knuckles, a thin white line across one finger that never fully straightened, the kind of hands that had learned early how to grip and hold without letting go. The waitress came by. He ordered water, no ice. For a moment, neither of us spoke, not because we didn't know what to say, but because there was no need to rush into it. Everything important was already sitting between us. "You don't look surprised," Ethan said finally. "I was," I replied. "At first. I'm not anymore." "That usually means the truth found a place to land," he said. I took a sip of coffee and set the mug down carefully. "You kept records longer than you had to." "Yes." "Why?" He glanced out the window, then back at me. "Because I was told to wait," he said. "And waiting didn't feel right." "Who told you that?" "Everyone," he said simply. "Supervisors, HR, lawyers, friends who meant well. They all said the same thing. Give it time. Let the process work." "And you didn't." "No," he said. "I watched my father die waiting for things to be corrected." The word father hit harder than I expected. Not because I hadn't assumed it, but because hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way documents never had. "I'm sorry," I said. He didn't react, not dismissive, not grateful, just neutral. "I know." We sat with that for a moment. "I wasn't trying to trap you," Ethan said, "or expose you. If you'd never called, I would have let it end there." I believed him. "Why me?" I asked. "Why not the city? Why not the company?" He considered the question. "Because you were the last decision," he said. "Not the first, not the loudest, but the last one that mattered." I nodded slowly. That was true. The system had been layered, distributed, but I'd been the point where hesitation could have stopped everything. "I didn't remember," I said. "I know," Ethan replied. "That's why I didn't come to you angry." I looked at him. "You weren't?" "No," he said. Anger assumes intent. This wasn't intent. It was something worse. "Convenience," I said. "Yes," he agreed. The waitress refilled my mug, asked if we wanted food. We both said no. She left without comment, used to conversations that didn't fit into small talk. "I need to understand something," I said. "What are you hoping happens now?" Ethan folded his hands on the table. "I'm hoping you stop pretending this was finished." "That's it?" "That's it," he said. "I've already lived with the rest." I thought about the years between the incident and now, about Ethan carrying a notebook no one had asked him to keep, about me living comfortably inside a version of the story that required nothing from me anymore. "You could have destroyed my reputation," I said. He met my eyes. "Reputations heal. People don't." That stayed with me. We talked for another hour, not about the incident, but about ordinary things. Work. His mother. The way construction has changed since we were both on sites. He'd left engineering 2 years ago, teaches shop classes at a community college now. Said he needed to work somewhere that mistakes could be corrected while people were still breathing. When we stood to leave, he hesitated. "I don't expect you to do anything dramatic," he said. "And I don't need an apology. I just didn't want you to live your life thinking this was someone else's burden." "I won't," I said. He nodded once, then walked out. I stayed behind, staring at the empty booth across from me, the indentation his weight had left in the seat, slowly rising back into shape. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. "City Council, meet and greet tonight. Thought you might want to come. Good optics." Optics. I pulled into my driveway and sat there with the engine running, the message glowing on the screen. Inside the house, the lockbox sat exactly where I'd left it. Quiet, patient. That evening, I went to the meet and greet. I shook hands, smiled when expected, listened to speeches about growth and safety and accountability. The words landed differently now, less solid, like they were resting on something hollow. Daniel introduced me as his former father-in-law, a respected public servant, someone who believed in doing things the right way. People nodded, complimented my career, thanked me for my service. I thanked them back. On the way home, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't afraid of being exposed. I was afraid of being forgiven too easily. Because forgiveness without truth doesn't heal anything. It just smooths the surface and leaves the fault line intact. When I got home, I opened the lockbox again. I didn't take anything out. I just looked at it. The vest, the notebook, the drive. For years, I'd measured my worth by the absence of consequences. Clean record, quiet retirement, a life that didn't make waves. Ethan had never asked me to confess, never asked me to suffer. He'd done something far more disruptive. He'd reminded me that responsibility doesn't expire just because paperwork says it does. I locked the box and placed the key on the table, not because I was ready, but because I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend much longer that this was someone else's story to carry. And for the first time since this began, I understood who the real confrontation was with. It wasn't Ethan. It wasn't the city. It was the version of myself that had benefited from silence and called it professionalism. That version of me was still alive, and I was running out of places to hide him. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through small, inconvenient moments, the kind you can't argue with because they don't announce themselves as important. I noticed it first on Thursday morning, standing in line at the grocery store, watching a man argue with the cashier about the price of bottled water. He was loud, certain, convincing himself that volume counted as being right. I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. Not irritation, recognition. On the drive home, I took a different route without meaning to. Cut through a residential area where new construction was creeping outward, lot by lot, framing half-finished houses, exposed beams, orange fencing flapping lazily in the wind. I slowed down instinctively, eyes scanning structures the way they always had. Nothing looked wrong. That was the problem. For most of my career, I'd believed danger announced itself. Cracks, sagging supports, obvious shortcuts. The reality was more subtle. Danger hid in things that almost worked, in decisions that made sense in isolation, in the quiet agreement between people to move forward and trust someone else to worry later. I parked near a cul-de-sac and sat there longer than I needed to, watching a crew pour concrete into wooden forms. No hard hats on a couple of them, a supervisor on his phone, back turned. The city would catch it eventually. Or they wouldn't. I drove away with the uncomfortable awareness that I'd once been the difference between those two outcomes. That afternoon, I opened a blank document on my laptop. The cursor blinked patiently at the top of the page, like it always does, waiting for direction. I stared at it, hands resting on the keyboard, and realized I didn't know what I was writing yet. Not a report, not a confession, something else. I closed the document without typing a word. It wasn't time. That night, I pulled out one of Claire's old notebooks from the hall closet. She'd used it to jot down lesson plans back when she taught middle school. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, arrows, marginal notes, reminding herself what worked and what didn't. She used to say teaching was mostly about catching small misunderstandings before they turned into permanent ones. I sat on the bed, flipping through it, stopping at random pages. Her voice came back to me in fragments, comments she'd made offhandedly, never intending them to matter later. People don't change when they're scared, she'd once said. They change when they feel responsible. I closed the notebook and rested my hands on the cover. Responsibility. Not legal, not professional, moral. The next day, Daniel called again. This time, his voice was tighter. "They're moving faster than I expected," he said. "Some bloggers digging into old safety cases. Nothing solid. But if your name comes up, it will?" I said. He stopped short. "What?" "It will come up," I repeated, "because I'm going to bring it up." Silence stretched across the line. "Mike," he said finally, dropping the careful tone, "you don't need to do that. There's no benefit. No one's asking." "I am," I replied. He exhaled sharply. "Do you have any idea what this could do?" "Yes," I said. "That's why I'm doing it." "This affects Noah," he said. The words sharpened now. "It affects all of us." "I know," I said quietly. "And that's why I can't pretend anymore that protecting him means lying to him." "You're not lying," Daniel insisted. "You followed procedure. The investigation cleared you." "I followed momentum," I said. "There's a difference." He didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder. "If you do this, don't expect support. I'm not asking for it." After the call ended, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the lockbox key. It felt heavier than it should have, a small piece of metal holding more weight than most people would ever notice. I thought about Ethan's words. This isn't about punishment. He was right. Punishment is reactive. It looks backward. What I was facing wasn't about what I deserved. It was about what I owed. Saturday morning, I drove to the public library. I hadn't been there in years. The parking lot was half full, families unloading kids for weekend programs. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper and disinfectant. I found a quiet corner table near the back and spread out my materials. Notebook, laptop, legal pad. I began to write not as an inspector, but as a man explaining himself without defenses. I wrote about the site, the conditions, the pressure to move projects forward, the decision to note a temporary adjustment instead of halting work. I didn't soften the language. I didn't dramatize it either. I wrote it the way I would have wanted someone else to explain it to me. When I finished the first draft, I didn't feel relief. I felt exposed, stripped of professional vocabulary and left with plain facts. I rewrote it anyway. By Sunday evening, the document was complete. 8 pages. No legal framing, no accusations. Just a clear account of what I'd done, what I'd failed to do, and why it mattered. I printed it out and placed it on the dining table. Then I sat there, staring at it, waiting for doubt to change my mind. It didn't. Monday morning, I made 2 envelopes, one addressed to the city's oversight board, the other to the victim's family. I hesitated over the second one longer, not because it was harder, but because it was real in a way the first wasn't. Institutions absorb information. People have to live with it. I drove to the post office just before noon. The line was short. A woman ahead of me argued about postage. A man behind me checked his watch repeatedly. Ordinary impatience pressed in on all sides. When it was my turn, I slid the envelopes across the counter. "Certified," I said. The clerk stamped them without comment. That was it. No dramatic music, no announcement, just paper changing hands. On the way out, I felt something loosen in my chest, not relief. Exactly. Alignment. Like a joint snapping back into place after being slightly off for too long. That afternoon, I called Ethan. "I sent it," I said. He didn't ask what. "Okay, I don't know what happens now." "I do," he said. "People will react. I can live with that." There was a pause. Then, quietly, "Thank you." "For what?" I asked. "For choosing to remember," he said. After the call, I sat on the porch and watched the sun sink behind the houses. The neighborhood kids rode bikes up and down the street, laughing, cutting too close to parked cars. Parents shouted half-hearted warnings. Life, unchanged. I knew consequences were coming. Investigations, headlines, conversations I couldn't control. I wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. But for the first time since this began, the weight I was carrying felt properly placed. Not hidden, not deferred, owned. That night, as I turned off the lights and headed for bed, I realized something that surprised me with its simplicity. I wasn't afraid of what I'd lose. I was afraid of how easily I'd lived without paying attention before. And that fear, quiet, steady, impossible to ignore, told me I'd finally stepped out of the space between legal innocence and moral responsibility. Whatever came next, at least it would arrive in the open. And this time, I wouldn't look away. The first call came 3 days later, at 8:06 a.m. I know the exact time because I was standing in the kitchen watching the coffee drip too slowly, counting the seconds between drops like I always did when my mind was trying to stay ahead of something. The phone buzzed on the counter, a number I didn't recognize lighting up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Mr. Donovan," a woman said. Her voice was measured, practiced. "This is Angela Reyes from the City Oversight Review Board. We received your statement." Not complaint, not accusation. Statement. "Yes," I said. "We'd like to schedule a formal interview," she continued. "Nothing adversarial, just clarification." I almost smiled at that. Nothing ever is, at first. We set a date. Next Tuesday, downtown. She thanked me for my cooperation and ended the call. Efficient, clean, as if we'd just discussed a parking violation. I poured the coffee out without tasting it. The second call came that afternoon. "Daniel." I watched his name flash on the screen and felt a tightening I hadn't felt before, not fear, but inevitability. I answered. "You actually sent it," he said, skipping any pretense. "Yes. Why didn't you tell me first?" His voice was sharp now, stripped of the careful tone he'd been using for weeks. "Because you would have tried to stop me." "And you think that makes this better?" he shot back. "Do you have any idea what people are already saying?" "No," I said. "But I'm about to find out." There was a pause. I could hear movement on his end. Papers shuffling, a door closing. He was somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. "This isn't just about you," he said. "My name is tied to yours. Noah's name is tied to mine. Campaign donors are calling. They're nervous." "I understand that," I replied. "I really do." "Then why would you do this now?" he demanded. "Why reopen something that was settled years ago?" "Because it wasn't settled," I said. "It was closed." "That's the same thing." "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." His breath came out hard. "You're choosing strangers over your own family." I looked out the window at the quiet street. the same jogger passing by as most mornings. I'm choosing to tell the truth, I said. What people do with that is up to them. That's easy for you to say, he snapped. You're retired. You've already lived your life. The words landed harder than he probably intended. Yes, I said. And that's exactly why I can't afford to pretend this doesn't matter. He didn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was cold and controlled. Don't expect us to stand beside you on this. I wasn't, I said. After the call ended, I sat on the couch longer than I needed to, staring at the blank television screen. The reflection looking back at me seemed older somehow. Not weaker, just more defined around the edges. By Thursday, the emails started. Journalists, bloggers, a few names I recognized from local outlets. Most were polite, curious, some less so. I didn't respond to any of them. Not yet. I wasn't hiding. I was waiting to see what the truth would do on its own. That evening, Laura came by. She didn't call ahead, just knocked once and stepped inside when I opened the door, like she'd already decided how this conversation was going to go. She stayed standing, purse still on her shoulder. This is spiraling, she said. No greeting, no small talk. Yes, I replied. You didn't have to make it public, she continued. There were ways to handle this quietly. I know. Then why didn't you? Her eyes searched my face, looking for something she could work with. Because quiet is how it stayed wrong, I said. She pressed her lips together. You're being selfish. I nodded slowly. That's one way to see it. Kate Mander. This hurts Noah, she said. He's already hearing things at school. My chest tightened. What kind of things? That his grandfather got someone killed, she said bluntly. The words hung between us, ugly and heavy. I didn't flinch, not because they didn't hurt, but because they were close enough to the truth that pretending otherwise felt dishonest. And what did you tell him? I asked. That adults make mistakes, she said. That people lie. I met her gaze. And did you tell him what people do after they realize that? She didn't answer. She left a few minutes later without saying goodbye. That night, I sat at the dining table with the lockbox open in front of me. I hadn't planned to open it. My hands had moved on their own. The notebook lay open to the page with my name on it. I thought about how easily the narrative had shifted, from respected inspector to liability, from quiet retirement to public reckoning. The speed of it was unsettling, but the direction wasn't. This was always where it led. Friday morning, the family I'd written to called. I recognized the area code immediately. I let it ring once, twice, then answered. Mr. Donovan, a woman said. Her voice was calm, but there was something tight beneath it. This is Maria Alvarez. I closed my eyes. I received your letter, she continued. I read it twice. Yes, I said. It felt inadequate, but it was all I had. I don't know what to do with it yet, she said honestly. But I needed you to know that. I understand. There was a pause. My husband trusted the site, she said. He trusted the people there. I need to sit with what you've told me. Of course, I replied. Take all the time you need. Before she hung up, she said one more thing. Thank you for not pretending anymore. After the call ended, I sat very still, the phone warm in my hand. Whatever happened next, that moment mattered. Over the weekend, I stayed home, didn't attend any gatherings, didn't answer any new messages. I watched the news without sound, seeing my name crawl across the screen beneath words like reopened, reviewed, questioned. I felt strangely calm, not because I thought I was safe, but because the waiting was over. By Sunday night, I realized something important. The pressure wasn't coming from the city or the media. It was coming from the people closest to me, from the quiet agreements we'd all made about what was acceptable to leave unexamined. Breaking those agreements was costing me comfort, approval, proximity, but it wasn't costing me sleep. As I turned off the lights and headed to bed, I understood that this was the price I'd been avoiding all along. Not punishment, isolation, standing alone in a truth that no longer allowed me to hide behind procedures or good intentions. And as uncomfortable as that was, it was also strangely clarifying. For years, I'd believed responsibility ended where my role did. Now, Stripped of titles and timelines, I was learning what it actually meant. Responsibility doesn't disappear when people stop asking questions. It just waits. And now that I'd finally answered it, there was no going back to the version of my life where silence passed for peace. The interview took place on Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after I mailed the envelopes. The building downtown hadn't changed since my years working for the city. Same glass facade, same security desk, with the same low hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I signed in, took a visitor badge, and sat in a chair that was designed to be neutral, and ended up feeling like an accusation. Angela Reyes met me in the lobby, mid-40s, hair pulled back tight, no wasted movements. She didn't shake my hand. "Thank you for coming in, Mr. Donovan," she said. "This won't take long." I'd heard that phrase before, usually from people who were about to ask for everything. The conference room was smaller than I expected. No windows, a table, 2 chairs, a digital recorder placed carefully in the center, like it had been measured. Angela sat across from me and opened a folder. My folder. I recognized the red tab immediately. "For the record," she said, "you're not under criminal investigation at this time." I nodded. "I understand." She studied me for a moment, as if deciding whether I actually did. "You submitted a personal statement outlining your role in a past structural failure," she continued. "You were not legally obligated to do so. Why did you?" The question was straightforward. No edge, no trap. "Because it was accurate," I said, "and because no one else was going to." She made a note. "You're aware this could reopen civil considerations." "Yes." "And professional sanctions? Even post-retirement?" "Yes. Without has been exposed, without an A2 rouse." She leaned back slightly. "Then help me understand why now." I didn't rush the answer. "Because time doesn't change responsibility," I said. "It only makes it easier to ignore." Her pen paused mid-word. Just for a second. We went through the facts next. Dates, inspections, reports. I answered without deflection. When I didn't remember something clearly, I said so. When something was uncomfortable, I didn't soften it. At one point, she slid a printed photo across the table. The ladder. The beam. The angle I knew too well. "Is this you?" she asked. "Yes." "And the note on page 3? She continued. "The temporary adjustment." "Yes." "You understood the risk?" "I understood enough to stop the project," I said. "I chose not to." She closed the folder slowly. "Thank you for your honesty," she said. "That's all I have for now." No verdict, no reassurance, just a door opening and closing behind me as I walked out. Outside, the sun hit my face harder than I expected. Downtown traffic roared like it always did. Life continued at full volume, indifferent to what had just happened inside a small, windowless room. I drove home without turning on the radio. When I pulled into the driveway, Daniel's car was already there. He was standing in the yard, phone in hand, pacing. He stopped when he saw me and walked over, jaw tight. "So it's official," he said. "They're reopening it." "They're reviewing it," I corrected. "That's the same thing," he snapped. "People are calling. Donors are backing out. Someone leaked the story before the interview was even over." I set my keys on the hood of the car. "I can't control that." "You could have," he shot back. "You chose not to." "Yes," I said. "I did." He stared at me like he didn't recognize me anymore. "Maybe he didn't. This is going to follow Noah," he said. "Kids don't understand nuance. They hear one thing and it sticks." "I know," I replied. "That's why I want him to hear it from me." Daniel shook his head. "You don't get it. This isn't about truth. It's about damage." I met his eyes. "They're not opposites." He laughed sharply, without humor. "You really believe this makes you better?" "No," I said. "I believe it makes me honest." He turned away, rubbing a hand over his face. "You always did this," he muttered. "Always had to be right." "Why?" I didn't correct him. Being right had never been the point. That was the difference. After he left, I went inside and sat at the kitchen table. The house felt different now, not emptier, not fuller, just exposed, like the walls had thinned. That evening, I received an email from my former supervisor. Short, professional. "I was surprised to see your name come up." I hope you're okay. For what it's worth, you were always thorough. I stared at the sentence for a long time. Thorough. That word had once meant something to me. Now it felt like a half-truth offered as comfort. I didn't reply. Later that night, Ethan texted, "How did it go?" "It started," I wrote back. "That's usually the hardest part," he replied. I thought about that. About how the act itself speaking had been less painful than everything surrounding it. The reactions, the distance, the way familiar relationships recalibrated around this new version of me. The next morning, I drove to Noah's school. I didn't tell Daniel ahead of time. I signed in at the front office, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, and waited on a small plastic chair that was clearly not designed for adults to sit comfortably. When Noah came out, his smile faltered when he saw my face. "Hey, Grandpa," he said cautiously. "Hey," I replied. "Can we talk for a minute?" We sat on a bench near the playground. Kids ran past us, laughing, yelling. The normal noise of childhood felt louder than usual. "I heard something," he said finally. "At school." I nodded. "I figured you might." "They said you didn't do your job right," he continued. "That someone got hurt." I took a breath. "Someone did get hurt," I said, "and I was part of why." He frowned. "Does that make you bad?" The question was simple, clean. Children have a way of doing that. "No," I said carefully. "But it does mean I made a decision I shouldn't have, and I spent a long time pretending it didn't matter." End quote. He thought about that. "Are you fixing it?" "I'm trying," I said. "Not by undoing what happened, but by telling the truth about it." He nodded slowly. "My teacher says fixing things sometimes means saying sorry, even if it doesn't change anything." I smiled faintly. "Your teacher's right." Before he went back inside, he hugged me. Quick, awkward. Then he ran off without looking back. I sat there alone for a few minutes longer, the bench warm beneath me. That afternoon, Maria Alvarez called again. "I've been thinking," she said, "about your letter." "Yes. My children asked about their father this morning," she continued. "They're old enough now to ask questions." I closed my eyes. "I don't know what comes next," she said, "but I wanted you to know that your honesty mattered, even if it hurts." "It does," I said, "and I'm sorry." She didn't say it's okay. She didn't say I forgive you. She said, "We'll talk again." End quote. Works. After the call ended, I realized something. The truth hadn't fixed anything yet. It hadn't restored trust or eased tension or brought closure. What it had done was remove my ability to hide behind outcomes. Whatever happened next, professionally, legally, socially, would happen in the open. That was the counter I'd chosen. That night, as I locked the front door and turned off the lights, I understood that this wasn't the climax of the story. It was the point of no return. From here on out, every consequence would belong to a version of me that had chosen to stand still instead of stepping aside. And for the first time, that felt like something I could live with. The fallout didn't arrive all at once. It spread. It moved through quiet channels, first emails that stopped coming, calls that went unanswered, invitations that quietly disappeared from my calendar. Then it reached the surface. Headlines, opinion pieces, a short segment on the evening news where my name was mispronounced but still unmistakable. Former city inspector reopens old case. Reopens. As if I'd been the one who closed it in the first place. The oversight board placed my statement under formal review. That phrase followed me everywhere, repeated by people who wanted to sound informed without committing to a position. Friends from my old department reached out cautiously, their messages carefully worded, heavy with concern but light on substance. "Hope you're holding up. Let me know if you need anything." Crazy situation. No one asked if I regretted it. That question didn't come from them. It came from myself, usually late at night when the house settled and the silence grew louder than it had ever been. I stopped going to the gym, not out of embarrassment, but because the conversations there had shifted. People glanced longer than necessary. Some nodded with a forced politeness that made it clear they'd already decided where they stood. Others avoided eye contact entirely. It wasn't hostility. It was distance. Distance is harder to argue with. The city sent a formal notice 2 weeks later. My professional license, though inactive, was being reviewed for post-retirement sanction. A symbolic action, my lawyer said when I showed him the letter. No financial penalty, no jail time, just an official acknowledgement that my record would no longer be considered exemplary. Most people fight this, he added. I'm not most people, I replied. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. No, he said. You're not. Is Daniel stopped bringing Noah by. He didn't announce it. He didn't need to. Weeks passed without a Sunday visit. When I texted, the replies were brief, polite, delayed. One evening, I drove past their house without planning to. The lights were on. I could see movement through the front window, life continuing without me in it. That hurt more than anything the city could do. Laura sent a message a few days later. We need space right now. Please respect that. I stared at the words until they blurred. Then I typed back a single sentence. I will. Respect had always been the easier choice when it didn't cost much. This time, it cost everything familiar. The media cycle moved on quickly. Another story replaced mine. That's how these things work. The outrage window closes. The audience forgets. But consequences don't follow the same schedule. The Oversight Board released its findings quietly on a Friday afternoon. My statement was validated. The procedural failures acknowledged. My role documented in neutral, bureaucratic language that stripped the situation of emotion while preserving its weight. There would be no charges. There would be no public apology from the city. There would be no restitution that made sense. The letter ended with a sentence that stayed with me longer than the rest. Your cooperation is noted. Cooperation. As if this had been a negotiation. I forwarded the letter to Maria Alvarez with a brief note. This is what they decided. She replied 2 days later. Thank you for telling us. We're still deciding what this means for our family. I read that line over and over. Not what it meant for me. For them, that distinction mattered. Ethan stopped calling. Not abruptly, not dramatically. The communication simply tapered off, like a conversation that had reached its natural end. He'd given me what he came to give. There was no reason for him to stay close to the wreckage. I didn't chase him. I understood, now, the cost of proximity. The house felt different in my absence from other people's lives. Not lonelier, quieter in a way that made room for things I'd never let surface before. I noticed how often I'd filled silence with productivity. How much of my identity had been tied to being useful, respected, consulted. Without those roles, there was nowhere to hide from the person underneath. Some nights, I slept better than I had in years. Other nights, I didn't sleep at all. On one of those sleepless nights, I opened Claire's notebook again. I read the margins, the arrows, the small reminders she'd written to herself. Check assumptions. Ask why twice. Don't rush the quiet kids. I realized then that what I was living through was the consequence she would have understood best. Not punishment. Alignment. Weeks passed. Then months. The city moved on. Daniel's campaign adjusted its messaging. Noah grew taller. The world continued to turn, indifferent to the fact that my life had shifted off its familiar axis. One afternoon, I received a handwritten letter. It wasn't from the city, or a lawyer, or a journalist. It was from Maria. The envelope was thick. Inside were 3 pages, written carefully, deliberately. She wrote about her husband, about the man he'd been before the job, about the anger she'd carried for years without knowing where to put it. She didn't accuse me. She didn't absolve me either. She wrote about the difference between being ignored and being acknowledged. You didn't bring him back, she wrote, but you gave us something real to hold instead of guesses. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, my hands shaking slightly. Not from guilt, from relief. That night, I sat on the porch and watched the neighborhood settle into evening. The same jogger passed, different music this time. A family down the street laughed over dinner, their voices carrying through open windows. Life, still ordinary. I thought about the version of myself from a year ago. The man who believed integrity was measured by clean files and quiet exits. The man who thought the absence of scandal meant the presence of virtue. He would have hated this life. The smaller circles, the unanswered calls, the long stretches of being unremarkable. But that man had lived comfortably inside a lie that required other people to carry the weight of his decisions. This version of me didn't have that luxury. And strangely, that felt like progress. I wasn't restored. I wasn't redeemed. I was simply here, standing in the open, without a title to shield me, without a system to absorb the consequences. What I'd lost was real, so was what remained. As I turned off the porch light and stepped inside, I understood something with a clarity that surprised me. This wasn't the ending. It was the cost. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly what I'd paid for. I didn't expect to hear from Ethan again. Not because things were unresolved, but because they were. Some relationships exist to deliver something specific, then step away. Ours felt like that. He had given me the truth. I had accepted it. There was no unfinished business left to justify another conversation. So when his name appeared on my phone one evening in early October, I stared at it longer than I should have. I answered on the third ring. "Michael," he said. Same voice, same calm. I wasn't sure if I should call. "I'm glad you did," I replied, and realized it was true. "I heard about the board's decision," he said, "and about everything else." Yes, there was a pause. Not the deliberate kind he used when choosing words. This one felt different. He was weighing something. "I wanted you to know," he said slowly, "that my mother asked about you." That caught me off guard. "Asked what?" "She wanted to know why you did it," he said. "Why you came forward when you didn't have to." I sat down at the kitchen table. "And what did you tell her?" "I told her you said it was because time doesn't change responsibility," Ethan replied. She thought about that for a long time. "What did she say?" I asked. "She said she wished someone had told her that years ago," he said. "Might have saved her a lot of waiting." Waiting, the word echoed. We talked for a few minutes after that. Nothing heavy. He told me he'd been thinking about leaving teaching, maybe starting a small consulting firm focused on safety compliance for nonprofits. Places that couldn't afford big firms but still deserved someone to slow things down when it mattered. Before we hung up, he said something that stayed with me. "I didn't expect you to carry this the way you have," he said. "Most people don't." "I'm not carrying it alone," I replied. "I just stopped setting it down." After the call ended, I sat there for a long time, staring at the dark window. My reflection looked older than it had a few months ago. Not tired, defined, like a photograph taken with higher contrast. The next day, Daniel called. I hadn't heard from him in weeks. I considered letting it go to voicemail, then answered. "Noah wants to see you," he said. No preamble, no apology. "When?" I asked. "This Saturday," he replied. "If you're up for it." "I am," I said. "Always." "It's Christ." We met at the park near his house. Neutral ground, benches, trees, kids running in wide arcs that never seemed to collide. Noah spotted me immediately and ran over, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. "Grandpa," he said, breathless. "Mom says I can stay an hour." "That sounds perfect," I replied. We walked the path around the pond, tossing small pieces of bread to ducks that gathered closer than necessary. Noah talked about school, about a math test he'd aced, about a friend who lied and got caught. "Do you think people can fix things even after they mess up?" he asked suddenly. I didn't answer right away. "I think," I said carefully, "that fixing isn't always about making things the same again." He frowned. "Then what is it?" "It's about making sure the mistake doesn't get buried," I said, "so it doesn't happen again." He thought about that, nodding slowly. "That makes sense." I good praise. Daniel watched us from a distance, arms crossed. When the hour ended, he approached. "Thanks," he said quietly. "Not warm, not cold, just real." "Any time," I replied. As Noah ran ahead toward the car, Daniel hesitated. "For what it's worth," he said, "I still don't agree with how you did this, but I can see why." "That's enough," I said. He nodded once and turned away. That night, I received an email from the community college where Ethan taught. They were starting a safety awareness seminar for adult learners, construction basics, risk assessment, ethics in compliance. They wanted a guest speaker, someone who could talk about decision-making from the inside. They wanted me. I stared at the screen, My first instinct, a sharp refusal. Exposure, scrutiny, more eyes. I could already imagine the whispers. Then I thought about the kids in those classes, people learning trades, people who would someday stand at decision points that looked small and felt reasonable. I replied yes. The seminar took place 2 weeks later. A small room, 20 folding chairs, no cameras, no press, just people listening because they'd chosen to be there. I didn't tell the story the way the media had. No headlines, no dramatic framing. I talked about fatigue, about momentum, about how easy it is to convince yourself that someone else will catch what you missed. I showed them the photo of the ladder, the note in the margin. This, I said, holding up the page, is where most failures live. Not in malice, in delay. Afterward, a young man approached me. My dad works construction, he said. He's always telling me to speak up when something feels off. I didn't get it until now. That was the first moment I felt something like closure. Not relief, purpose. Later that evening, Maria called again. I went back to the site, she said. I needed to see it. Yes, I replied. It's strange, she continued. Standing there now, knowing what I know, it feels different. I imagine it would. I don't know if I forgive you, she said honestly. But I don't need to carry anger the way I did before. I closed my eyes. Thank you for telling me. Before hanging up, she added, Ethan told me you're speaking to students. Yes, I think that matters, she said, more than apologies. Well, I thinks first. After the call, I understood the twist of it all, the thing I hadn't seen coming. This story wasn't about punishment or redemption. It was about inheritance. Not money, not reputation, responsibility. Ethan hadn't wanted revenge. Maria hadn't wanted ruin. None of them had wanted my suffering. They'd wanted something passed forward, intact, the truth, without distortion, without silence. The cost I'd paid wasn't to balance scales. It was to stop a pattern. As I turned out the lights and headed to bed, I thought about the man I'd been when this began. A man who believed doing nothing was neutral. A man who trusted systems to absorb his choices. That man would never have understood this ending. Because this ending wasn't a win. It was a handoff. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I was leaving behind. The first winter after everything settled was quieter than the ones before it. Not calmer, just quieter. Fewer calls, fewer interruptions, fewer places where my presence felt expected. I learned quickly how much noise had once been proof of relevance. When that noise faded, what remained was a kind of stillness I'd never practiced living inside. I started waking up later, not because I needed the sleep, but because there was no reason to prove anything to the morning anymore. The ceiling fan still clicked as it turned, but I noticed it less. Some habits loosen when they're no longer guarding something. I kept speaking at the community college once a month. Not formally, no titles, no introduction beyond my name. I didn't tell the full story every time. Sometimes, I just talked about small decisions, about how professionals are trained to solve problems, but rarely trained to stop motion. After one session, a woman in her 40s waited until the room cleared. I quit a job once, she said. Everyone told me I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Do you regret it? I asked. She shook her head. I regret how long it took me to listen to myself. I nodded. That regret had a familiar shape. Daniel and I settled into something that wasn't reconciliation, but wasn't distance either. He brought Noah by again, though less often. We avoided talking about the case unless Noah asked questions, which he still did sometimes, in the blunt way kids have. One afternoon, while we were building a small shelf in the garage, Noah paused and looked at the level in his hands. It's off, he said. I leaned over. He was right, just slightly. What do you do? I asked him. He adjusted it carefully until the bubble centered. You don't pretend it's straight, he said. You fix it. I smiled and handed him the screws. That evening, Daniel lingered after Noah went inside. I still don't love how this went, he said, but I can't say you ran from it. That's fair, I replied. He nodded. Noah's proud of you. He doesn't say it directly, but I can tell. That mattered more than approval ever had. Ethan sent a postcard from New Mexico in the spring. No return address, just a picture of open land and a single sentence written in careful ink. Still paying attention. I pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. Maria invited me to a small memorial gathering that summer. No press, no speeches, just family, a few co-workers of her husband's, and a quiet acknowledgement of a life that had been cut short. I stood at the edge of the group, not sure where I belonged. She came over and handed me a folded program. "You can stand closer," she said. "You're part of the story now, whether you like it or not." That is rid. I stood where she indicated and kept my hands folded, the way I always did when I didn't trust myself to gesture. When it was over, she hugged me briefly. No words. None were needed. The house stayed the same. Same walls, same furniture, same photographs. But the way I moved through it changed. I stopped avoiding certain rooms, stopped skirting memories like they were hazards to be marked and bypassed. I took Claire's notebook out more often, not to reread it, but to add to it. Blank pages filled with thoughts I'd once considered unproductive, questions without answers, reminders that didn't tell me what to do, only what to notice. Momentum isn't neutral. Silence is still a choice. Delay has a cost. Those weren't lessons I could pass off as theory anymore. One evening, months later, I received a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Donovan," a young man said, "my name is Alex. I'm in one of the safety seminars you spoke at. I wanted you to know I stopped a job last week. It pissed some people off, but it was the right call. I didn't call him back. Not because I didn't care, but because the message was complete on its own." That was when I understood what this all had been moving toward. Not redemption, transmission. The truth doesn't need a hero. It needs continuity. Someone willing to hold it long enough to pass it on without altering its shape. I used to think my legacy was a clean record. Now I know it's a trail of decisions other people might hesitate at for half a second longer because they've seen where shortcuts end. On the anniversary of the incident, I drove past the site again. I didn't stop. I didn't need to. The building stood as it always had, functional, unremarkable, absorbed into the background of daily commerce. Failure doesn't always leave visible scars. Sometimes the only mark it leaves is on the person who finally refuses to forget it. That night, I sat on the porch as the sky darkened, the neighborhood settling into familiar rhythms. Somewhere down the street, a radio played softly. A dog barked once and went quiet. I thought about how this story might sound to someone else, less dramatic than they'd expect. No courtroom climax, no villain exposed, no clean victory, just a man who stopped letting time excuse him. I don't know how long I have left. None of us do. But I know this. When my life finally narrows to its last honest shape, it won't be defined by what I protected or preserved. It will be defined by the moment I chose to stand still, look directly at what I'd done, and say, "This matters enough to carry forward." I didn't win. I didn't get forgiven by everyone. But the ground beneath me no longer shifts when I think about the past. And for the first time, that's enough.